On December 20, 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress, named Lucky Strike, limped over the English Channel, resembling a battered beast that simply wouldn't give up. Its third engine had vanished entirely, not merely failed, but ripped away by anti-aircraft fire above Bremen, carving a massive tear in the wing. Crimson trails of hydraulic fluid streaked the body of the aircraft. The ball turret dangled precariously, its operator lost forever. According to every guideline, protocol, and engineering formula from the Army Air Forces, this aircraft ought to have plummeted into the North Sea a full 20 minutes earlier. Yet it pressed on. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, the pilot, managed to hold the damaged machine aloft using sheer willpower, fervent pleas to a higher power, and an extra edge, something the maintenance team had applied to his aircraft 3 weeks prior, far outside official procedures. When Lucky Strike at last touched down at RAF Bassingbourn, it balanced on a single landing gear strut, the opposite one jammed shut due to zero remaining hydraulic pressure. Webb slid that behemoth along the runway amid a blaze of sparks visible from the distant control tower a mile off. Emergency responders braced to extract remains. To their astonishment, 8 crew members emerged unaided, rattled yet breathing. The sole casualty, that ball turret operator, had perished over the objective, but the rest returned safely despite piloting a craft that, per after-mission reviews, had forfeited main hydraulic operations, endured severe fuel line destruction, and faced electrical glitches that rendered stable flight unattainable. Colonel James Albertson, the group leader, gazed at the debris on the apron and posed the sole relevant query: how? The formal explanation would emerge over months. The true secret lay in a nearby hangar, just 200 yards distant, where a figure was buried up to his elbows in the cowling of yet another B-17, applying alterations that could have landed him in a court-martial had superiors recorded them accurately. In essence, the Army Air Forces during the closing months of 1943 grappled with an issue they struggled to spell out in debriefings. Bombers were dropping from the sky. That was par for the course in combat above Nazi-held territory, where the Luftwaffe offered no mercy. However, aircraft were succumbing to injuries that logically shouldn't prove lethal. One unlucky shell burst in a vulnerable area, and a B-17, designed to withstand hits that would obliterate 3 fighters, would simply drop from the group. A design defect existed, though Boeing refused to acknowledge it. The higher-ups in Washington dismissed the complaints, and air crews paid with their lives. Lucky Strike's escape owed nothing to chance. It demonstrated that an individual had pinpointed the vulnerability and patched it via techniques that would send supply chain experts into fits. This tale recounts how a single technician's unauthorized tweaks transformed the B-17 from a probable coffin on select raids into the iconic survivor etched in history. It all began with a fellow who honed his repair skills not in formal classrooms, but in a gritty workshop from the Great Depression days in Pittsburgh, guided by one unbreakable principle: get it running or it stays broken. Staff Sergeant Paul Zuck wasn't meant for aircraft maintenance. His service records showed mechanical skills strong enough for the motor pool, hauling trucks, jeeps, the essential but mundane gear that sustained a base. Yet an official at Bassingbourn's assignment desk spotted his pre-war background and shifted him sideways, a decision that likely preserved countless lives. Prior to enlisting, Zuck had operated a fix-it shop in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill area, servicing coal haulers, delivery vehicles, and even illicit moonshiners revved up Fords on shoestring budgets that barely scraped by. He reported to Bassingbourn in August 1943, age 26, grease ingrained in his skin, and a disdain for rules that drove his superiors to both frustration and admiration. During his initial days on the tarmac, he observed a lead mechanic sidelining a B-17 over a fractured hydraulic conduit. Textbook protocol, spot on per technical order 012-EG2. But the spare was delayed in shipment, the bomber remained idle. The sortie launched short-handed by one. Zuck wondered aloud why they couldn't detour around the faulty part and loop into the backup conduit. The mechanic stared as if he'd proposed duct tape for the wings. "Chow." "That's not procedure, Sergeant," Zuck fired back, his thick Pittsburgh drawl slicing through like a socket wrench, a retort that soon echoed through the shops. The manual never patched rigs through the hard times of the 30s. I sure did. What set Zuck apart from the tech school graduates was their rigid adherence. They nailed every step in the orders, performed fixes to Boeing's exact specs, and upheld B-17s at peak factory standards. Zuck had a knack for spotting flaws in setups that were crumbling, posing queries the engineers seemed to overlook entirely. Like, what if this setup fails right over Germany with no spare parts stash at 20,000 feet? His brilliance lay not in grasping how systems ought to operate ideally, but in figuring out how they might hold up despite total chaos. Come October, fellow mechanics began observing a peculiar trend. Aircraft Zook handled kept returning from sorties they had no business enduring. One bomber he tinkered with endured flak ripping through the hydraulic compartment. It should have forfeited all control over the landing gear, yet the pilot pulled off a touchdown with wheels intact. Another aircraft suffered primary power loss following a fighter strike. Still, the gauges functioned just long enough to guide the navigator back safely. The crew chief dismissed it as mere chance. Fortunate chance, he called it. Zuck rejected the notion of luck. He trusted in backups and duplicate setups, in channeling vital operations via routes absent from Boeing's schematics, routes Boeing evidently hadn't pondered amid encounters with German 88mm shells. As other techs swapped out components, Zook improvised redesigns in real time, cobbling together salvaged bits, pilfered pipes, and wiring rigs that'd horrify any overseer. His colleagues dubbed him the plumber for his constant habit of redirecting lines. Hydraulics, fuel conduits, electrical harnesses. He'd toil for hours, past shift end in the hangars, flashlight clenched in his mouth, reconfiguring aircraft in undocumented fashions, since his tweaks technically breached roughly 15 Army rules. When pressed on why he invested the effort, instead of lounging in the motor pool with coffee and steering clear of hassle, Zuck's reply was straightforward. Those fellows run the ops. The very least I can offer is ensuring the bird doesn't take them out on the return leg. The B-17 Flying Fortress was billed as virtually unbreakable. Boeing's hype all but declared it, and initial battle accounts from 1942 backed that up. Fortresses limped home from raids resembling airborne sieves, with punctures riddling wings and bodies, and still, they pressed on. Airmen earned the Flying Fortress moniker for a solid cause. These beasts could shrug off damage that'd obliterate a B-24. However, by the tail end of 1943, an unsettling trend surfaced in the casualty figures that everyone preferred to ignore. Aircraft weren't solely dropping from massed fighter swarms or precise shell strikes to key zones. They were plummeting due to isolated breakdowns, a lone impact in a vulnerable area, and a $200,000 bomber plus its 10 skilled crew would veer from the group and vanish. The 8th Air Force endured around 5% losses per raid by fall 1943. Run the numbers. A team's shot at completing the mandatory 25-mission stint boiled down to a 50-50 gamble. Something was dooming B-17s in ways that shouldn't have proven lethal, and it fell to hands-on techs like Zook, scrutinizing the debris firsthand, to pinpoint the issue. Hydraulics. The B-17's fluid network governed all the essentials for staying alive. Undercarriage, brakes, flaps, and above all, the turrets enabling gunners to follow enemy pursuits. Boeing crafted a streamlined layout, routing main conduits along the hull in neat groupings, logical for peacetime optimization. But streamlined equaled clustered. A single shard of shrapnel piercing the misplaced 6 inches of hull, and hydraulic flow collapsed across several functions at once. A bomber might boast 3 operational engines, solid wings, and a fit team. Without fluids, though, dropping the gear proved impossible, and a B-17 scraping its belly on an English strip frequently turned into a blazing wreck. Then came the fuel setup, with its distinct talent for fatality. The B-17 hauled 2,180 gallons of premium avgas across 9 tanks, 5 wing-mounted, 4 in the body. The distribution was engineered to shift fuel from outer wings toward the core, preserving equilibrium. Sound design, save for the fact that interconnecting pipes traverse spots squarely in the firing arc during German beam assaults from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock angles. A 20mm shell nailing a fuel line didn't merely drain reserves, though it did so disastrously. It unleashed avgas misting through the frame where scorching fragments, live wires, and frigid air at 40 degrees brewed ideal sparks for blaze or vapor clog. Zook picked up on oversights buried in the text summaries. Downed planes from enigmatic mishaps frequently displayed fuel corks right before impact. Aviators described stuttering motors, followed by quits, then the craft shuddering to pieces or igniting. Wreckage exams, whenever scraps remained, repeatedly flagged fuel tainting the issue became obvious once you looked closer. Flak or bullets could rupture a fuel line, letting air infiltrate the setup. Engines would fail one after another since they all drew from the same vulnerable pipeline. The bomber wouldn't plummet from excessive structural harm, but from essentially suffocating its own power. Boeing's designers had crafted a machine that performed flawlessly in perfect scenarios. Yet, battling across German skies in 1943 was far from perfect. It demanded that every component endure damage and keep operating regardless. The B-17's fatal flaw lay not in its defenses or armament, but in its reliance on single failure points. That's where Zook began his interventions. One unapproved tweak at a time, Zook's actions weren't strictly against the law. They were graver. Unsanctioned on-site alterations to fighter plane mechanisms. If a craft went down and experts linked the mishap to his changes, he'd risk a court-martial for reckless endangerment leading to death. But Zook had crunched the numbers his own way. Without intervention, those planes dropped from the sky regardless. This approach at least gave them a fighting shot. At the heart of his taboo solution was a starkly straightforward idea. Build in backups where Boeing had skimped. Transform that sleek, streamlined hydraulic setup into a tangled web of reserve conduits that resembled a pipefitter's worst dream, yet held up when the core path got blasted. Zook began raiding hydraulic pipes from wrecked planes in the scrap area, materials meant for formal reclamation. He'd slice out intact segments, verify their seal under pressure with a makeshift manual pump, then weave them in as detour routes on operational birds. In real action, it played out like this. A typical B-17 featured a single primary hydraulic conduit linking the pump to the gear controls. Zook would splice into it at two spots, one up front by the pilot's area, another back near the comms section. From there, he'd snake a parallel route via an alternate trail, often wedged beside the frame beams for shielding from debris. Next, he'd fit manual shutoff levers at those connections, pieced together from junked wrecks. Should the main conduit rupture and bleed pressure, the flyer could simply lean over, Zook positioned the levers for easy grab, and flip to the spare line. It lacked polish, it piled on extra pounds, it breached Tech Manual ZAO 120 EG2, Part 4, Para 12, Sub C. But it spelled the gap between touching down on landing gear or skidding along the tarmac on the fuselage, hoping for the best. His overhaul of the fuel setup pushed even bolder boundaries. Zook knew he couldn't shield lines from impacts. That came with dodging flak. What he could do was halt one breach from triggering total blackout. He fitted transfer valves linking the fuel reservoirs, borrowing from ground fueling spigots. By the book, those were ground-only tools. Zook placed them for mid-air access and logged them on logs as fuel transfer verification fittings, accurate but artfully imprecise. So, if a line got punctured, crews could seal off the faulty reservoir and redirect supply from healthy ones straight to the hungry motors. The upgrade that truly preserved crews targeted the wiring grid. B-17s ran a central power rail, feeding gauges, radios, and gun mounts alike. A single strike there left you in the black. No dials, no signals, no defenses. Zook routed auxiliary feeds from the backup dynamo right to vital spots, sidestepping the primary rail altogether. He concealed these in stock wire packs to mimic original installs unless you followed the paths. He chose yellow sheathing over the usual black, signaling pilots to the switches for crisis backups. Zook's genius lay in repurposing what was already there. No fresh inventions. All bits came from the plane itself or spare stocks. He merely reshuffled the elements and patterns Boeing's team hadn't envisioned, as they'd prioritized factory speed over battlefield endurance. A 1943 Seattle assembly line bomber was meant for rapid builds by novices, like recent homemakers turned riveters. Zook's tweaks called for a savvy tech versed in interconnections, bold enough to stray from plans that were costing lives. Come January 1944, Zook had stealthily retrofitted 17 B-17s in the 351st Bomb Group. No fanfare, no records, just quiet labor on overnight shifts, dodging nosy brass. And those 17 craft were returning from sorties at rates that were noticeably, it seemed, statistically improbable. On February 8, 1944, Captain Ronald Fletcher, the engineering officer for the 351st Bomb Group, was enduring a rough start to his day, one that was destined to deteriorate further. He had been conducting standard upkeep checks, selecting planes at random from the tarmac, and confirming they aligned with their official specs. But when he pried open the hydraulic compartment on a B-17 named Devil's Daughter, he discovered piping that had no business being there. Fletcher was no fool. Prior to the war, he'd studied aeronautical engineering at MIT, and he knew how to interpret schematics. The setup before him didn't appear on any Boeing diagram he had encountered. Extra hydraulic conduits snaking along unconventional paths, hand-operated shutoff valves mounted in spots demanding bespoke supports, fuel transfer links pieced together from components that looked like they came from at least 3 distinct models, and everything executed with such precision that it screamed intentional, well-planned alterations rather than hasty wartime fixes. He tracked down Zook in Hangar 3, where the sergeant was busy with an engine replacement. "Sergeant, we have to discuss Devil's Daughter's hydraulics." Zook kept his focus on the engine housing he was tightening, barely glancing up. "What's the issue?" Fletcher brandished his inspection notepad. "What's the issue? How about the roughly 40 feet of unapproved hydraulic tubing laid out in irregular configurations, complete with manual controls that aren't listed in the manuals?" Zook laid aside his tool, cleaned his hands on a cloth even filthier than his palms, and shot Fletcher a gaze blending exhaustion and resistance. "You after the by-the-book response, or the truth?" Fletcher shot back without hesitation. "Both. Begin with how long this has been going on and which planes are involved." 17 aircraft. That figure sent Fletcher's pulse racing. 17 operational bombers with unrecorded tweaks to essential flight controls. The breach of protocol was monumental. Zook risked a court-martial. Fletcher could end up under scrutiny for overlooking it earlier. Yet then came the pivotal query from Fletcher. Has a single one of these 17 planes suffered a hydraulic breakdown? Zook fished a smudged journal from his overalls pocket, his private log off the official books. 3 caught flak damage to their main hydraulic roots, each returned safely using the secondary setup. Devil's Daughter touched down on her landing gear just 2 weeks back, after an 80mm shell shredded her primary conduit above Frankfurt. The pilot had no clue he was running on reserves until I pointed out the harm after the flight. Fletcher ran the numbers mentally. 3 severe hydraulic strikes, no casualties. Official data indicated at least 2 of those birds should have been scrapped. By midday, Fletcher had brought the matter to Group Commander Albertson, the same colonel who had observed Lucky Strike's improbable touchdown the previous December. At 1400 hours, Albertson was on site in the hangar, scrutinizing Zook's alterations as Fletcher offered expert commentary. And by 1600 hours, a tense gathering unfolded in the operations room, debating whether to prosecute Sergeant Zook or pin a decoration on him. Major Henry Watkins from the 8th Air Force Engineering Division showed up on February 10th to launch an official probe. Over 3 days, he burrowed into Zook's reworked planes, snapping photos of the setups, poring over upkeep records, and quizzing air crews. His initial assessment, submitted on February 13th, included a section that likely took ages to compose, since it basically confessed the Army Air Forces had dispatched squads into battle aboard needlessly exposed machines. Although SSGT Zook's alterations are unsanctioned and contravene current directives, initial review indicates they mitigate inherent weaknesses in the hydraulic and fuel configurations that could factor into battlefield attrition. Advise holding off on penalties until full technical review and supervised trials. That section preserved Zook's livelihood, though it cracked ajar a portal no one at the Pentagon cared to unlock. The portal revealing how many airmen perished due to Boeing favoring assembly line speed over battlefield resilience. Albertson issued a leadership call that likely skirted some rules of its own. Zook dodged prosecution, but he was barred from tinkering with additional planes pending the technical review. Meanwhile, those 17 heavy bombers would continue their sorties, as even the top echelons could grasp the odds of survival. Major Watkins came back to Bassingbourn on March 3, 1944, accompanied by a pair of Boeing technicians, a squad of Army Air Force experts, and instructions boiling down to verify its effectiveness or expose the hazards, but hurry, we're losing aircraft over the Reich. What ensued was the wildest, most high-pressure engineering check ever in military flying lore, pushing unapproved on-site tweaks through real battle scenarios, all while debating whether to log it as a breakthrough or prep for a court-martial. The Boeing techs, civilians hired by the military, were shocked right off the bat. The head guy, Carlson, who'd helped craft the initial B-17 blueprint back in Seattle, wasted his first hour at Bassingbourn tossing around terms like contamination hazards, pressure control issues, and risks of total breakdown. He faced a half-stripped bomber, jabbing at Zook's detour pipes, schooling Watkins on how this setup defied core hydraulic engineering rules set by degree-holding pros. Zook, decked out in oil-smeared overalls, waited him out, then dropped a question. "When did you last run a wartime flight?" Carlson got defensive. "I'm a designer, not a flyer." Zook gave a nod. "Got it. So you built this setup in Seattle, where the biggest headache is a botched pressure check. I fixed these machines after they limped back riddled with bullet holes. Totally different view. Watkins's idea was bold as hell. Outfit a few of Zook's altered planes with extra gauges for pressure, meters for flow, and tracking gear. Then dispatch them into live raids, capturing how the systems held up. In a normal buying routine, you'd start with weeks of bench tests. But this was March 1944. The skies over Germany were at peak fury, and the 8th Air Force was dropping 6 bombers on average per sortie. No time for drawn-out delays. From March 5 to March 18th, 5 of Zook's revamped B-17s racked up 11 raids hitting spots like Berlin, Brunswick, and Friedrichshafen. Every plane had bonus sensors logging hydraulic pressure, fuel throughput, and power grid behavior the whole way. 3 took hits in the fight. All 5 returned safely. The numbers didn't lie. During the Friedrichshafen run on March 18th, a plane dubbed Memphis Belle II, one of Zook's tweaks, caught an 88mm flak explosion that ripped the main hydraulic conduit right where Boeing's layout snaked it past the bomb hold. The gear clocked the lead line's pressure, crashing to nothing in 4.2 seconds. By the book, that meant no control over gear, flaps, or brakes for landing. But the Memphis Belle II's skipper, he'd gotten Zook's direct rundown in the prep talk, flipped 3 hand-operated cutoff valves. The reserve kicked on. Pressure evened out at 85% of standard, subpar, sure, but solid for ops. The bird held formation, dropped its load, and touched down at Bassingbourn on its wheels, as ground crew eyed the feeds and grasped they'd witnessed the impossible. A hydraulic setup that toughed out a disaster. Carlson, the Boeing specialist, stared at the replay data without a word. At last, he faced Watkins and muttered what must have stung to say. "It shouldn't function. The pressure shifts are off, flow is skimpy, bypass lacks real filters, yet it pulls through. No clue how, but it does." Zook, lurking at the rear of the debrief hall, chimed in with a take that likely skipped the formal write-up. "It pulls through 'cause I built it for when shit's already hit the fan. Yours shines till it craps out, mine chugs poorly nonstop but never quits." The trial run spat out 47 sheets of specs, 11 post-mission summaries, and a finding the Air Force techs had to face. Zook's changes boosted endurance without shorting the main setup. In plain terms, safer rides, no downsides. On March 20th, Watkins submitted his wrap-up, urging a call that'd echo across every B-17 outfit in England. Greenlight the field fix per Zook's scheme and school up techs in all 8th Air Force units. Come April 1944, as the Pentagon bickered over formal buy-in paths and Boeing haggled deals that'd drag to June minimum, another shift brewed on bases throughout East Anglia. Wrench-turners were swapping stories. And when techs chat, it's not red tape, it's results. Staff Sergeant Mike Deakins from the 303rd Bomb Group at Molesworth caught wind of Zook's hacks via a transferred lead hand from Bassingbourn. By April 8th, Deakins hit Bassingbourn on a parts haul, pad ready, begging Zook to demo the hydraulic detour setup. Zook gave him a full 3-hour rundown. Every joint, every valve position, every line of piping. Delicus returned to Molesworth that very night and began altering planes. In just 7 days, the 3 squadrons of the 303rd had 5 bombers equipped with Zook's setup. Technical Sergeant James Wu at Thorpe Abbotts heard about it from Delcroix. Come April 15th, the 100th Bomb Group, known as the Bloody 100th for their highest casualty figures in the 8th Air Force, had their ground crews pulling overtime to fit bypass setups on all flyable planes. No one sought approval. No paperwork was submitted for changes. They simply proceeded, driven by the sight of too many bombers lost to wounds that ought to have been recoverable. This was an underground wave of innovation rippling through unofficial channels as the higher-ups argued over organizational charts. Master Sergeant Robert Chen at Kimbolton began recording data that the Air Force hadn't yet bothered to monitor. Back in March, prior to any tweaks, the 379th Bomb Group saw 14% of missions aborted due to mechanical issues. By the end of April, with 12 planes featuring Zook's upgrades, that figure fell to 6%. Chen's personal ledger, unsanctioned and overlooked, revealed an even more compelling trend. Planes with mods that suffered combat hits were 3 times as apt to make it back to base as their stock counterparts facing equivalent harm. Formal clearance arrived on April 28, 1944, via technical order Dero Bano 0 EG2127, a field upgrade for boosting hydraulic redundancy in B-24 and B-17G models. It spanned 6 pages of red tape that basically greenlit what scores of techs were already handling. Yet the order played it safe, restricting itself to the hydraulic tweaks while ignoring Zook's fuel crossfeeds and wiring shortcuts. Boeing still claimed those were pointless and risky. Zook skimmed the directive and chuckled bitterly, the kind of grim amusement from a guy who'd nearly faced court-martial for life-saving ingenuity, only to see the system now half adopt his ideas and claim the glory. He resumed fitting fuel crossovers during graveyard shifts, defying rules as always, since HQ's memo didn't alter the reality of B-24's plummeting from fuel glitches. By May 1944, the upgrades had reached roughly 120 planes in 7 bomb groups. Officially, only 41 got the nod under the new order. That discrepancy highlighted crews who eyed the rules, eyed the aircraft, and chose Zook's path. Seek pardon later rather than clearance up front when souls hung in the balance. Return stats began emerging that even the Air Force had to notice. Zook's own 341st Bomb Group, where almost every active B-24 sported the complete mod array, including the off-books fuel and electrical bits, posted a 2% loss rate in May 1944. The 8th Air Force norm stood at 3%. It may seem minor, but over a month's worth of ops with thousands of bomber runs, it meant scores of air crews landing safely instead of listed as MIA. Colonel Albertson, whether in a stroke of genius or professional recklessness, summoned an 8th Air Force stats team to Bassingbourn in early June to scrutinize the unit's survival records. He laid it all out, the approved changes, the rogue ones, and the hard data. The team's June 9th filing included a key line affirming what every wrench-turner on the tarmac instinctively grasped. There's a strong statistical link between upgraded planes and better odds of survival, exceeding random fluctuations and justifying broader rollout. What began as rebellion turned into doctrine. Zook's approach became the blueprint, and throughout England, techs kept slipping in unapproved tweaks post-lights out, because policy lagged behind the full solution. They were all Zucks now, every non-com with tools who weighed a rule against a reg and prioritized getting pilots home over blind adherence. August 1945. Europe's conflict had wrapped up 3 months prior when a stats expert at Air Force HQ, Captain Dorothy Henshaw, assembled a report that stayed under wraps but laid out irrefutable figures. She pulled mission records from all B-17 units in the 8th, matched them against upkeep journals, noting which birds got Zook's mods, both the sanctioned and the stealth ones that crews backdated into logs, and crunched numbers that would have impressed her profs. Units boasting 75% or more uptake of the whole package, hydraulics, fuel, electrical, displayed a 23.4% boost in return rates compared to back to their unmodified standards. That figure accounted for 347 bombers safely returning home rather than crashing over Germany or the North Sea. Consider multiplying that by 10 crew members per plane. Add the fact that certain crews endured even after their aircraft went down. Zuck's unauthorized solution had preserved the lives of roughly 3,000 to 4,000 airmen who might otherwise have perished, been taken prisoner, or vanished without trace. Yet the truly significant statistic lay hidden within Henshaw's supplementary figures. B-17s equipped with the full Zook upgrade package that endured Category 3 damage, meaning harm necessitating extensive repairs or component swaps, made it back to base 81% of the time. Planes without the upgrade facing the same severity returned only 47% of the time. The upgrade didn't render B-17s impervious, but it transformed damage that could be survived into genuine returns, rather than mere numbers on a ledger of losses. Paul Zook left the Army Air Forces in November 1945 as a technical sergeant, earning an Army Commendation Medal for outstanding skill in aircraft upkeep, with zero reference in his service file to the on-site alterations that marked his wartime impact. He returned to Pittsburgh, revived his garage on Polish Hill, and dedicated the following 3 decades to servicing automobiles, trucks, and the odd aircraft from a nearby aviation group. He rarely discussed his military experiences. In 1973, Dr. Michael Torres of the Air Force Historical Research Agency located Zook during research into combat-era adaptations. Torres passed 3 days in Pittsburgh, conversing with Zook and examining the private upkeep journals, those oil-smeared ledgers never entered into formal archives. Torres posed the query that ought to have come 3 decades sooner. Why hazard a court-martial for unapproved changes? Zook's response, captured in Torres's notes, came across as typically straightforward. It didn't strike me as all that dangerous. Men were losing their lives because the aircraft had flaws from the factory. I had the option to correct it or stick to the rulebook. Looked like a straightforward decision. The B-17 Zook first altered, Lucky Strike, the aircraft that ignited the whole effort back in December 1943, lasted through the conflict and got dismantled in 1954. However, images of its hydraulic compartment from the 1944 technical assessment appeared in Air Force upkeep guides that remained in use through the 1960s. The labels avoided naming Zook, alluding solely to on-site devised backup systems. Countless mechanics across generations drew from his innovations without learning the originator's identity. Boeing later wove aspects of Zook's alterations into the B-17G assembly line from late 1944 onward, though records attributed the updates to progressive design tweaks instead of crediting them to grassroots innovations from a high school-educated sergeant who had picked up engineering know-how maintaining trucks through the Great Depression years. The after-war B-29 and B-50 bomber initiatives built in duplicate hydraulic and fuel setups as core elements, drawing from hard-won insights over German skies and analyzed by designers who studied the combat adaptation records. Paul Zook passed away in 1989 at 72 years old. His obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette skipped any reference to B-17s or his service role, highlighting merely that he was a veteran who operated Zook's auto repair for 40 years. His private upkeep journals, the informal chronicle of each plane he had reworked, went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton following his passing. They rest in the study collections today, open to anyone inquiring, comprising 47 volumes brimming with engineering drawings, side margin pressure computations, and mechanics' terse notations that reveal the true account of how one individual's defiance of protocol shifted the fortunes for thousands of flyers unaware of his existence. The outlawed method evolved into routine procedure. The independent thinker shaped a model. And the insight that those nearest the issue often spot, fixes overlooked by remote office experts, endures whenever anyone weighs protocol against practical reality with human lives hanging in the balance.